Welcome back. There is not a week that Democrats don't remind us how reliable they are.
Orders, take away our privacy, take away our dollars, take away everything we have. We are going to fight this fight. I am going to stand with you in this fight, and we will win. We will win. We will win. We will win.
How worthy heirs of the legacy of FDR they are.
And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
And so it's not surprising that the reactions to Trump's betrayal of Zelensky have been either sporadic and in no case affirmative of an alternative proposal. So, and much of this is a consequence of Biden's terrible policies on Ukraine, and specifically in the role Putin would play if he wins in Ukraine. So it was in February that I posted a tweet foreseeing that Trump was planning to betray Zelensky. And it was not just this article from Politico from 2022 where he praises Putin, but more specific clues that led me think in that direction. It was only more recently that some other people in media have started to see more clearly that that was an ambush, even if they still don't have clear what the purpose of the ambush is. So let's start addressing Europe's reaction. At first, it seemed plausible. It was even a new bank was created, the DSR Bank, to fund not only the increase of military spending, but also the harmonization of that spending, which is something that still has not been addressed and has led to disastrous consequences in procurement. Because if defense production was fragmented in Europe, but was ruled by some rules that make it homogeneous, compatible, it would not be a bad thing. But when you have, for instance, 155 millimeters shells that don't fit with 155 millimeter shells produced by other European countries, then you have a problem. When I read recently that they were willing to, this time for real, seize the frozen Russian assets, this was something that should have been done earlier, but at least if they were willing to do it now, before a ceasefire was declared, would have been some encouraging step forward. The declarations of elected of Friedrich Merz, the front runner for chancellor in Germany, also were encouraging, as he even got the Greens to give to this constitutional amendment imposed in the Merkel era that limited the increase of debt, which is needed in the case of Germany, not only to relaunch their industrial model, but also the defense. So, similarly, his declarations that Europe could not longer rely on the United States, even though that implied heavy investments, because the European defense has been built around or as a complement of the United States participation. What makes covering for the covering for the effort to substitute American participation much more difficult, like in the case of the Patriots. Europe doesn't have an equivalent to the Patriot, and but at least it was an encouraging step forward. Similarly, with Macron offering of using France's nuclear capabilities as a deterrent, considering the many times Putin has used the nuclear blackmail. Even initial Keir Starmer's participation was positive. He committed to the Ukraine defense. Europe have a summit where they pledge the funds, this time hopefully for real. And Macron offered to overreach to to additional allies the same as Starmer. This seemed in turn with a decline of American influence, which gave Russia and China, especially my concern is Russia, because they are championing a militaristic option China has not embraced yet, fortunately, and which offer Taiwan an alternative in case Trump pull over from Taiwan, from our commitment to Taiwan and South Korea. So that allowed me to give an initial encouraging answer to Jack Watling's question, but does it have the will? It seems to start finding the will, having the will, finding that will that has been lost for so long. And because, as Paul Krugman notices, compared to Russia alone, Europe has the resources to fill the gap left by the United States and prevent Putin prevent Putin from becoming Xi Jinping's senior partner. That might lead China to a terrible war in which Putin and China would be fighting together. That's the worst case scenario. But then we started to see the first signs that Europe had big mouths but small hands, like in the case of their unfulfilled commitments to Ukraine, for instance, in 2023, about shells for artillery, where they offered 1 million and could only supply 300,000. It's not surprising in the case of peacekeepers. It's not surprising that Scholz, with his commitment to appeasement, had not committed German soldiers. But when Donald Tusk from Poland also refuses to commit peacekeepers, that starts being worrisome. When Starmer, after decrying the treason committed by Trump, begins to convoke a coalition of the willing to support to be a backstop of a peace plan pushed by the United States, so by the same Donald Trump that betrayed Zelensky instead of proposing an alternative, that is worrisome because that's very disappointing in the case of Starmer, especially when you see that Trump has shown sympathy for Putin's demand that not peacekeepers be committed, and therefore that the new ceasefire would be another Minsk Accord, uh, which with no guarantee, with no peacekeepers. And you might say, well, but 30,000 peacekeepers are not going to be the difference. Probably not even the 150,000 demanded by Zelensky, considering that the Ukrainian army is 1 million is 1 million soldiers strong. But it sends a very clear message because if Russia attacks those peacekeepers and those peacekeepers die, that will cause a reaction in the European countries from which those peacekeepers come. So it means we are willing to put our political capital, we are willing to put our people at the side of the Ukrainians, at least in this small amount, and this is at least in this small number of soldiers, considering that the bulk of the casualties are being supported by Ukraine. So that the fact that you are very willing to make pledges despite your bad record in the past of fulfill pledges, but not commit peacekeepers, sends a bad message. Then the debate about the mineral deal signed by Zelensky with Trump has always been framed in the wrong terms. Is this after the initial assessments that led Donald Trump to demand a 500 billion deal backed by those minerals, new findings have shown that the minerals, rare earth, and others are based on outdated maps where geological studies would have to be updated, where there are best chances of gallium and titanium, but by far we have the updated information and much less guarantees for the production of these, for the exploitation of these minerals. But the matter is not the value of this rare earth mineral, their potential or commercial value of these minerals. The discussion is about the result, how Ukraine can exploit those resources in the best way possible in order to be an independent and reliable friend who could not be destabilized by Putin. So it's basically the same discussion from months ago about the defense industry and the request for a no-fly zone in West Ukraine, which was ignored. Demand that was also present in Zelensky's victory plan, which Europe ignored, didn't back. So, and the same apathy is shown now because, for instance, in lithium, the the main sources of lithium for Europe are Serbia, which is a country that has a very dubious relationship with Putin, and China. So you could say Ukraine would be a more reliable source of lithium for Europe, and therefore that would be their leverage to compensate the political opposition, people like Starmer, Merz, Tusk or Macron could find in their internal political debate of their countries. So that's why this deal should not have been signed. The apathy shown by Europe, especially by Starmer, who has seen their mission in this drama as Donald Trump's squire, who wants to back whatever Trump decides with giving the resource, providing resources for a ceasefire that is not going to be but another mixed agreement, a setup that could have disastrous consequences not only for Ukraine but others, is, as I said, is very disappointing. Some people have speculated that the reason why Trump betrayed Zelensky was that he wanted Putin to help him broker a new deal with Iran or improve relationships with North Korea. I believe a more realistic explanation could be the potential for economic dealings in the future if Donald Trump believes Putin could offer him a door into the yuan zone, considering that Putin himself needs now the yuan zone to siphon the wealth stolen by he and his oligarchs. But whatever the reason is, that this betrayal was very clear from some time ago. For instance, first came the pressure for increase the draft to 18-year-olds, but with in Ukraine, but without enough resources, without enough supplies to facilitate the rotation of troops. Let's remember that the reason why the 155 and 157 brigades trained in France failed was because there was not enough resources to rotate troops, so the more seasoned soldiers could be removed from the front and integrated to these new brigades to give them cohesion. So basically were brigades made up of green soldiers. But to remove those soldiers from the front, you need more supplies in terms of drones, in terms of air defenses, patriots, in terms of artillery, in order to keep the Russians and North Koreans at bay. Otherwise, you could not move those people from those defensive positions. Then he echoed Putin's. So the idea, it seems, was to first push Zelensky to get a piece of legislation, the draft for 18-year-olds, that make him very unpopular, push for elections in which Trump echoed Putin's demands, besides calling Zelensky a dictator, even though legislation inside Ukrainian legislation, which the Ukrainian opposition supports, uh, allows Zelensky to stay in power until the war ends, and yet Trump called Zelensky a dictator. So the idea was to get rid of Zelensky via elections, that in the best case could lead to bring a more docile counterpart, or if not, another Yanukovych. Because in the end, that's the idea. Russia demands all the conditions that would allow him to get another Yanukovych or to destabilize another Zelensky. So it's not surprising that after Donald Trump took away intelligence sharing, not just the Patriots, because he suspended aid that has been approved and sent, were prepared to be sent very late, irresponsibly, very late by Joe Biden. Putin launches a counteroffensive with North Korean troops and retakes Kursk. So it's not surprising that Europe, not having Europe the alternative to those patriots, not being doing good enough in increasing supplies. And I am talking about the storm shadows, which are not perfect substitutes for the Patriots, but they are, or the Atacams especially, but they are good enough. Zelensky had to cave, and it's not a coincidence that Putin precisely used that gap in U.S. support in intelligence to launch with North Korean troops their counteroffensive in Kursk to evict the Ukrainians from one of their best cards of negotiations. In the case a peace treaty was negotiated in the short term. This is obviously not a coincidence. They knew the intelligence was going to be interrupted. What would have left the defenses, Ukrainian defenses, blind. Putin took the opportunity that was set up by Donald Trump. So so when we see all this, we wonder, where is Europe? And we remind Jack Watling's recommendations to make possible a negotiation, how Ukraine must be able to turn the tide before negotiations come. And on the contrary, we see Russians evicting the Ukrainians from Kursk with North Korean troops. And then we see in another Foreign Affairs article an echo of one of Jack Watling's assessment. Even if Europe gave guarantees to a ceasefire in Ukraine, unless it was very clear that Ukraine had turned the tide, that would only lead to a pause which Putin would use not only to strengthen his army, but also to destabilize Zelensky, especially if he only gets another Minsk Accord agreement, and that could turn the tide. That could lead to another Yanukovych. Remember that in Georgia, tired of seeing Europe's indecision, many Georgians ended up voting for the pro-Putin candidate. And that's something that could also happen in Ukraine because Ukraine has seen so much devastation and so much hesitation in Europe. On top of that, they see Trump's betrayal. Europe should be invocated in their internal in their internal debate the image of Munich and Czechoslovakia in 1938 because we are repeating history. Putin's economy is dependent on war. He needs war to stay in power to avoid painful adjustments. And our answer is we appease. We gave him another Minsk agreement. So suggestions have been made about how to prevent this new ceasefire from becoming a new Minsk agreement. And one of the top points is strengthening Ukraine militarily, and yet we see hesitation. In what we see is hesitation in more pledges, but a hesitation in issues that could have so the effort to improve procurement is something that is yet to be seen because after they are consider that they are taking this step after 3 years of war. After 3 years of war, they realize they are not prepared to substitute American help in NATO, even though many times in the past, people in NATO, the leaders of NATO demanded Biden to transfer the American weapons committed to Ukraine to a trust, and I echo that request to transfer those weapons to a trust so they could not be suspended or subjected to Trump's caprice to not rush the deal. There is a recommendation to not rush the deal, and yet that's exactly what we are doing with the support of Keir Starmer, who sees his role not as having a say in this deal, brokered pretty much by Putin and Trump, but on finding the resources to make that deal possible. That's very disappointing. So, not to mention that Donald Trump is is in favor of incorporating Putin's false narratives, which, for instance, would isolate Ukraine from Europe. Not only that, but also impose the conditions to destabilize Zelensky or any future leader who opposes Putin's rule. So we get back to the question: do they have the will? This question more recently asked by Jock Watling, but in the not long ago also raised by General Ben Hodges, American General Ben Hodges, British NATO General Richard Chiref. And so this is nothing new. And the question is not directed now to Trump because Trump doesn't have the will. The direct question is still directed to Europe, and Europe is still found wanting. So, what's the hope? The last hope we have to avoid this worst case scenario, which is war with Russia and China, is MERS, but MERS still is struggling to get a government. He won the elections almost a month ago, but is still struggling to form a government, considering the short-sightedness of some of the center left and center parties in Germany, and considering the intransigence, the obvious intransigent alternative for Deutschland is going to show, considering their sympathies for Vladimir Putin. So my advice is to, as in other countries of Europe, to invoke the image of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. I have elaborated on the parallels between that moment that led to a much bigger war, much bigger Second World War than could have been that could have happened had not been Europe been trapped by the childish delusion of peace a la Chamberlain, or in other words, appeasement. So I'm not going to repeat that here. So you can watch that video if you want. But some propose that the result, if unless Europe finds the will, it's still lacking, is the Finlandization of Ukraine. And unfortunately, if Europe doesn't find the will to, which right now depends on MERS, that's exactly going to be the best case scenario, because the worst case scenario is not the Finlandization, in which the country makes concessions like Finland made to Stalin, but remains independent and connected to the West. No, it's the destabilization, the turning Ukraine into another Belarus. And so, and that sends a terrible message to the rest of the world, something that has been also expressed by Japanese Prime Minister Ichiba, who in his own words say that the United States not coming to the defense of Ukraine because it is not a NATO member is truly frightening. And that's the kind of assessment other countries are going to make if Putin elevated to the rank of senior partner, and with China struggling with its economy, and Europe, the United States sanctions, and ends up endorsing the way Putin makes foreign policy and trade, and the Sahel is a good example of that. Or if you want, Iran and Syria have been good examples of that. What brings us to 2 points. How unrealistic is to assume that you can by surrendering, by betraying Ukraine, by surrendering Ukraine, you are going to win back Russia to the relations as they were before 2022. And I'm not saying 2014, I am saying before 2022. But this is naive. This is naive because Putin knows well that if there is another, hopefully better government in after Trump, hopefully a democratic leader after Trump, but not Biden, not one like Biden, one who wants to be a transformative president, then all the gains he could get with Trump's favor could be short-lived. So there is his expectations about ties to the West are also going to be short-lived. The place where the stolen wealth is going to be safer is going to be in the yuan zone, not in the West, not again. So believing that you are going to win Russia to weaken China is naive. And by doing that, you are precisely isolating the United States in the hope that Russia is going to become your pal when strengthening the chances of the worst case scenario in which you have a war with Russia with a superior military to China, but also with China, which has the economy to that could allow that that Russian military machine running for a long time. Is this too difficult to fathom? No, it's just what it has been happening in a much smaller scale. Had China decided to cut its ties, its economic ties to Russia, Russia could not have been able to wage war for more than a few months. It would have had to capitulate. I'm not talking about to settle with Ukraine. I am talking about capitulation, and that could have led to the collapse of the Putin regime. So Russia and China, Russia's military and China's economy complementing each other are the worst case scenario. And China is not yet on board. That's why I have advocated for so long for a trade deal with China, besides the fact that China's overcapacity is not going to go away just by imposing tariffs on China's products. So that's an issue you have to deal with, because China is the second economy in the world. So if China decides to go for the so-called nuclear option, which is a big devaluation, you are going to have a very hard time trying to counter that with tariffs. So, and yet that would be not the worst case, because the worst case is what Paul Krugman has called military adventurism. Now, in this last month, it's not just China, it's also India, because India, as China has apparently got back to their old policies about oil suppliers, it's India, which is now the number one buyer of Russian oil. So now you would also have to consider India. The good news is that India has always been against Putin, and also China. We cannot deny that. China's push to turn the BRICS into a West and anti-West platform. Besides, India would also have interest in redefining the role of sanctions, the withdrawal of sanctions against Russia, which only would be possible with a real sound peace in Ukraine. So you saying that we would have to discuss sanctions with India? Well, yes, because if you don't, you would have exactly what you have right now. You can sanction Russian oil, but Russian oil is still going at discounted prices to India and China, and you cannot stop it. So what good are your sanctions if many countries are not abiding by them? It's much better to have a clear redefinition of the role of sanctions. And besides, also, this is also in the interest of China, uh, which as I said, has to deal with a huge overcapacity, and we have it's the problem. You might say, and yes, it is, but it's also ours because of China's size. So it would be much better to get a deal where, as part of which is also that they adopt more sound economic policies, so their population is in the capacity to absorb much of that overcapacity. Besides other concessions like they having a bigger say in multilateral organizations, which are demands that both India and China have demanded for a long time. For instance, in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but also in the appeals panel from the World Trade Organization. And that would be in our interest because Putin doesn't want to have a bigger say in multilateral organizations. What Putin would like to see is then dismantled. Let's remember that this organization had to the role in these organizations like this had the role in the international order envisioned by FDR after the end of the Second World War to precisely to counter the spheres of influence. What Putin wants is not a multilateral organization. What Putin wants is a return to spheres of influence, which is to what FDR's international order degraded, starting with Truman and the start of the Cold War. So when we read news about China is struggling to escape a cycle of deflation, of increasing their defense budget this year to in 7.2%. We should remember that those could be signs that China is considering that military foreign adventurism mentioned by Paul Krugman, and that's which I call part of the worst case scenario. And that's not something that has coming out of nowhere or that I have imagined during the weekend. This is something organizations like RUSI have been foreseeing for a long time. So if you want to fall, if you believe that the betraying Ukraine is a small price to pay in order to avoid war with Russia, think better, because that's not the worst case scenario. And by doing that, you could be inviting the very real worst case scenario, which is war with China and Russia. And having said that, I leave you with our newscast.
Good evening.
This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news.
A. Disney finds a way to make the Snow White remake profitable. CEO Bob Iger has confirmed that Disney has secured the sponsorship of Haldol, a medicine used for Tourette's, after offering it as a medicine against verbal incontinence. The idea came to us just last week. Are you afraid your verbal incontinence has made your employer lose millions and you could end up out of a job? Essential Pharma loved it, and the marketing campaign started right away, added Disney's CEO. B. Minority Leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, announced the new strategy Democrats will use to counter the negative consequences of President Trump's agenda. It's called the salami strategy. President Biden used it successfully to beat Putin in Ukraine and VP Harris. Well, never mind. The point is that you don't have to win anything. You only have to raise money and confuse your opponent, then you identify his red lines and then wait and see to check if they were Trump's real red lines. That's all. It has been crafted by the same strategists that led the Harris campaign, and that's why we know it's good, announced Senator Schumer. C. After it was announced this morning by Senator Schumer, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and DNC Chair Ken Martin complimented Schumer's salami strategy. It was worth waiting for a plan like this. For months people called us weak, irrelevant, clueless, but now we have a real plan. I can see it already. Congress in 2026 and the White House in 2028 with the ticket Harris-Biden. And nobody can say any Democrat has come up with something better in the past. Nobody. Adamantly, Jeffries concluded his assessment of Democratic chances in the upcoming years.
This has been the news of this hour. Sponsored by Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? Did you vote for Trump in 2016 and then in 2020? This is the right church for you. If so, Church of the Holy Redeemer's Power in the Spirit is the only Christian church that can promise you in the Lord to have 72 virgins in heaven for only a donation of $50 a month. You will have access to those 72 virgins in heaven. For an additional $25, you will be allowed to replace 10 of them, and for $100, Heaven Premium, you will be allowed to choose them for yourself. Guaranteed, if you're not satisfied with those 72 virgins after you die, full refund of your money. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.